thanks everybody for being here and taking time out of your Friday noon. Hopefully some folks are getting some food and taking care of themselves. This is going to be a conversation with Marina Schauffler, author of Inescapable, and myself, Bill Pluecker, public policy organizer for Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. Before we jump right into the conversation, I'm going to just go over some of our working agreements here at MOFGA as we all share space respectfully. We should all be respectful, curious, and open. Recognize that no one knows everything, but together we all know a lot. And we can't all be articulate all the time. Give the benefit of the doubt and ask questions. We take care of ourselves, stretch, eat, drink, use the restroom as you need. And that goes for being on camera or off camera, exactly as makes you feel most comfortable. One voice, one mic at a time, and we'll keep folks on mute until we get to a Q&A portion later in the conversation. We'll do our best to avoid jargon, acronyms, and industry language. There is a lot of acronyms within this conversation about PFAS, which are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Be aware of time. We'll try to make sure we stay on target and be done around 1. We'll speak from our own experience. We'll challenge assumptions. We'll be conscious of our intent versus our impact. Sometimes you say things and lands in a way you're not quite you didn't expect. And so be responsible for our impact. And we'll avoid using isms without explaining what we mean by them. And just once again, thank you to everybody. And Marina, thank you so much for being here. Do you want to just give a brief introduction about yourself and just give us a quick introduction to your book for those who haven't checked it out yet?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. So yes, the book Inescapable grew out of several years of research following Maine's confrontation with PFAS. And initially, like everyone else living here, I started to see isolated news stories about particular farms or, military site exposure, whatnot. And I felt like there were some threads that needed to be woven together, that people needed to see how PFAS had come to permeate so many aspects of our lives and how that was infiltrating our ecosystems in all sorts of ways that we weren't necessarily aware of. So I made a proposal for a fellowship to do an article series, and that kind of evolved eventually into the book.
Yeah, and it is, I think it's this conversation we've been having here in Maine for, going back 10 years now. If we go back to when the first farms were starting to discover what had happened and come forward to the legislature and come forward to the media a little bit about their own experience. But I think it's been slow to just, while we all kind of know that it exists, but getting any kind of detail about how it is in our lives, how it isn't affecting agriculture and affecting farmers in particular, I think is a big thing that MOFGA focuses on and that we continue. And that's one of the reasons we're here today, to try to talk about how is it in our lives, and when you see it in the media, have a little bit more context to what's going on. Before writing the book, Marina, did you already know a lot about PFAS, or was it really just you had seen kind of broad media conversations about it and needed to get into it?
I had not heard about it before it really started surfacing, I think around Fred Stone's farm initially, and then, a number of the MOFGA and other farms. There was a sort of flurry of farms when the state first started to publicize the map showing, where sludge had been spread historically. And so while I didn't know about PFAS specifically, I did know a lot about, I had spent a lot of time researching Rachel Carson's work and life. And so I kind of knew how this script often goes. So there was a lot of context there, even though it was a new class of chemicals. There are, as you can tell in the book, I draw from her writing on numerous occasions, and there's a long historical legacy there, as you well know and MOFGA knows.
Yeah. I just, for folks who might not know who Fred Stone is, we can talk about his experience a little bit. So Fred Stone is the first farmer in Maine that really started coming out, talking about his own experience with contamination. And there was a public water supply near his farm that tested positive for PFAS, and the town had been testing it, and they were looking for causes for the PFAS contamination to be so high. And in the process, started coming to Fred and asking Fred about his experience, and they pretty quickly started nailing down on this sludge application. And the sludge application was something that was encouraged by the Maine Department of Agriculture, as well as encouraged by the US EPA, because they saw it as a beneficial use of sludge. And the sludge is coming from wastewater treatment plants. The wastewater treatment plants are bringing together kind of the bulk of the excrement from residential spaces, as well as this highly charged, highly contaminated industrial effluent that's coming from manufacturing. And so it creates a situation where you have very large quantities of solids that are become toxic because you've added all this toxicity to them. And so the country needed to get rid of this sludge. And after the Clean Water Act in the early 80s, they said, well, we're not going to dump it directly into the oceans anymore because there was recognition that that was causing pollution in the oceans. So the next best thing, of course, is to put it on farmers' fields. I say that sarcastically, of course. And so Fred had been doing this. And Fred, along with it, Marina, who did the testing in Fred's case? Do you know?
The water district did the initial testing, and then DEP came in and did much more extensive testing. You know, they did a very thorough job. They didn't acknowledge right off that this was a much more widespread problem. Fred Stone knew that because he had been distributing this sludge to other farms in his area. So he knew he was not, you know, as he likes to say, a unicorn, the way it was initially portrayed. So,
yeah. So he knew, even though the state wasn't willing to acknowledge it, that this was a widespread practice. And initially, there was some effort to say, oh, Fred's been doing it in a particular way, which was particularly harmful to him. And but what he knew is it was a widespread practice. And pretty quickly, after finding that his cows and the milk and the water on his farm, as well as the soil and the feed, were all contaminated, he couldn't stay in business anymore. The milk distributor who had been purchasing it from him cut him off. And so at that point, that's when we started coming back to the legislature to see what is the appropriate response. And Marina mentioned a DEP map earlier. And for anybody who might not be aware of that, Marina, would you want to talk about the significance of that map, or kind of the evolution of how we got there?
sure. The legislature called for the DEP to assess where this had where the sludge had been distributed historically. And Maine was fortunate and far-sighted in having kept good records. I don't think that's true in all other states. So Maine at least had, you know, reasonably good records of where this sludge might have gone. And after, you know, a few years of kind of foot dragging and denial, I want to call out there was a change in administration in Augusta, and there was the creation of a PFAS task force. And that was a really important step, I think, in terms of um, bringing a lot of people together from diverse uh, backgrounds to look at this problem. But it was also a huge step towards greater transparency and, taking this information out to people. And I think the mapping was part of that greater commitment on the part of government. There was, I think, and Bill, you could probably speak to this more in terms of the legislature, but a pretty widespread sense that there was some culpability on the part of the state because it had promoted this practice. And so there should be, you know, a greater transparency to rebuild trust. And part of the putting the map out there online so that everyone could see where this stuff had been applied and where should the sites that should be tested, um, and having a very responsive email at DEP so that people could email in questions and get information back promptly. I think that was an important part of what Maine did right in this process.
Definitely so. And that responsiveness, I think, was rare, especially in a state and in the agencies, which was really important. And I think that map really spread consciousness, like publicly as well as amongst farmers, about the breadth of the contamination. And then they needed to go out and do the testing to figure out exactly how bad it looked. I realized as we were talking about it, we didn't go into maybe the health effects of PFAS or why the public writ large might be worried about this being in their food and water. Marina, do you want to briefly talk about some of the health effects and why the public should be would potentially be worried about it?
Sure. They're far ranging and they are still evolving. One of the frustrating things about PFAS is that there has been so little scientific and medical research. It's a broad class of chemicals, 15,000 chemicals. And among those, it's not even clear how many are in commercial use. I've seen estimates of, between 3 and 5,000 are in commercial use and applications. Of those, only probably maybe 100 or so have had, any notable study. And when it gets down to really thorough medical research, it's numbers in the dozens of PFAS. So any description of medical impacts is very constrained by the amount that we know through medical research. But what we do know so far is a number of these compounds have um, effects developmentally. They pass through, to embryos, and there's more and more research on what the impacts can be for children over time through that exposure. There's several cancers associated, kidney in particular. There's liver problems. It's one federal public health official said there's basically not an organ system in the body that PFAS don't affect.
Yeah, and the body kind of reads them, doesn't recognize that it's foreign to the body. It reads them as fatty acids, and then takes them in and actually makes them starts using them in the construction of different parts of our body, especially the ones that you see more fatty acids in. So it tends to be in the different organs, tends to be in your blood, and so the part of it is that your body doesn't recognize them as a foreign element, and so isn't good about excreting them. And so once they come into your body, they kind of stay in your body, and it becomes a longer term problem for all of us. And as Americans, we all have PFAS in our bodies. Many of us were born probably with PFAS in our bodies, and so trying to understand that lifelong impact of having it incorporated into different organs is just a huge issue. Scientific issue that we haven't really adequately addressed. And I think, and that which goes back to the politics of, and Marina, you mentioned this as a class, and the idea of that when there's 15,000 different chemicals that we're trying to regulate, it becomes just, if we do it one by one, just an overwhelming attempt, and we're decades away or more. So what Maine has done is we've defined PFAS as being one bond between a fluorine and a carbon, which incorporates all of those 15,000 different chemicals in the class. And that bond is what makes them so significant and important, because that bond doesn't break down under natural situations. And it also it's not formed. It's formed by human beings. It's not formed in nature. So, and this is the toxic bond. So as long as that bond is there, we're saying it is a PFAS. And we faced serious pushback on that definition here in Maine. I think there were 5 different bills to change the definition. There would have included a change in the definition of PFAS in this past legislative session. Fortunately, MOFGA, along with a lot of other coalition partners, worked to fight back on that. But that's going to continue to be an attempt. And they use this excuse that we haven't done the medical science yet, so therefore they should not be regulated, along with the PFAS that we know are causing all these human health impacts. So I think, Marina, you mentioned Rachel Carson, and I wanted to bring in the idea of the precautionary principle. Like, why should we be thoughtful about what we're doing before putting these chemicals into the world?
Yeah, one of the reasons I included so many of her quotes was they still speak so profoundly to this imbalance we have in our chemical regulation system. And it has been really from the very first act controlling toxic substances, it grandfathered, thousands of substances already in use. So really, as far back as we've attempted toxic regulation, we have not put, as Carson recommended, the burden of proof on the manufacturers, requiring them to demonstrate that their products are safe before they go to market. We have it completely reversed. In my book, I have a quote from the journalists Dan Fagan and Marion Lavelle in their book from the late 1990s, Toxic Deception, where they say our chemical quote unquote regulation system operates like an anti-Hippocratic oath. Mm-hmm. Instead of do no harm, it is, do what industry wants and disregard the public health. So because we don't have that precautionary principle, we're putting chemicals out into the market without really oftentimes any thorough, medical or scientific analysis of their impact. Then we start to see the problems arise, but it can be years or decades before there's any action taken to withdraw them. And as we see with PFAS, that's still a very slow process. 2 of the 15,000 PFAS have been voluntarily withdrawn from the market, but we still have ample evidence of harm and can't get products off the market. So Europe has done better, not perfectly, but they have made a stronger commitment to the precautionary principle than the US has.
Yeah, and I think that's a failure that not just affects PFAS, but affects all of these chemicals in our lives across the board. And it seems to make so much common sense that before they invent a novel chemical and put it into use, we should know it's not going to harm anybody and it's not going to harm the environment. And just incredible. So Maine, along with Minnesota and some other states, have been at the forefront of this PFAS conversation. And one of the things that we've done along with Maine did eventually ban the land application of biosolids because we saw the impact of that, biosolids being the same thing as sludge, just a different word, and a greenwashing, really tried to make the sludge sound a little cleaner than it actually is. So I switched back and forth between using them, though I tried to stay with sludge. So we banned the land application of sludge because we saw the impacts on farmers, we saw the impacts on our food system, saw how it was impacting our surface water as well as the groundwater we were drinking. And so where you have this concentrated contamination issue at the wastewater treatment plants or at a landfill that's receiving these biosolids, this sludge, spreading it all around the entire state becomes an issue. When we go to try to clean up, when we try for remediation, becomes just a huge, enormous problem requiring hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of effort to clean up. So really better to keep it in one place or to eliminate it completely. And so I don't know, Marina, if we were the first, but I'll let you answer that in a second. When we talk about PFAS product ban, so making consumer product ban, making sure PFAS isn't in our day-to-day lives, making sure it's not in our cosmetics and our floss and in our food wrappers and in our pans, pots and pans. And Maine was out front early in that conversation. You want to give us a little the history there, Marina?
Yeah, it was, it not only led the nation, but led the world in taking that action. And, it's quickly discovered the challenges involved in trying to kind of go upstream and find out, where this material was getting added to products. The businesses charged with doing that here struggled greatly to figure out, work back in the supply chain and figure out where PFAS was getting added, or if PFAS was getting added to various products. And you could probably speak to this more, Bill, but Maine doesn't have a lot of clout internationally, being 1.3 1.4 million people. We're a very, very small market, and so that made it difficult. And maybe you could speak, Bill, to the strategy as Maine revised its product ban, of working in conjunction with Minnesota, which had just gone through a similar process at that point.
Yeah, and that was exactly right. We kind of felt like we got away with something with that initial ban, which was just this blanket ban that was going into effect on PFAS and consumer products. And then we quickly figured out, and then they noticed us. The lobbyists noticed us, the corporations noticed us. I was like, this is going to be trouble if anybody follows Maine's lead here. And so working amongst different state legislatures, because at this point we're still not seeing any real movement from the federal level. And later on in the conversation, we'll talk about some of the walking back that we're seeing from the feds on so many of these issues. But so coordinating between different state legislatures, in this case, particularly Minnesota, saying, okay, if we can start to see consistent attempts between the states to regulate and moderate these things, then the corporations, instead of backing what the corporations have been threatening Maine when they saw our product bans come in place was, well, we're just not going to sell to you, particularly around pesticides. That was the most pronounced conversation. So, well, we're just not going to register our products in the state of Maine, and you're not going to have access to this. And that was really like an effort in the media to put pressure on us as legislators. My other role as a state legislator, I represent House District 44, which is Warren, Hope, and Union on the coast. And I've been the chair of the Agriculture Committee in the State House for 4 years now. And so putting pressure on us as legislators to say, look, you're going to deprive your populace of these things if you don't let us put PFAS in them. Essentially, if you don't let us poison them. And so that became a tussle. And they got a lot of media around and that pressure tactic. So when we started working across state boundaries, started working with other legislators and legislatures and other states, we had more power and more of an ability to try to move the conversation forward. In fact, I'm forgetting my timeline now, but I think it was last year that they actually passed a ban on PFAS in cookware in California, and then it was quickly vetoed by the governor, recognizing he was basically falling under some of that pressure from corporations. And I did have a question in my notes here about corporate capture, and what does corporate capture mean, and how does that really influence this conversation? I think federally, and maybe the conversation is, why is there less corporate capture at the state level?
Yes, I think Maine has been fortunate in having less corporate capture. Corporate capture is basically when the what should be the regulatory bodies that should be upholding public health are instead caving to corporate interests. That could be direct lobbying pressure, that could be the revolving door of staff who move from corporation to the governmental regulatory agencies. That has happened a lot at the federal level with the US EPA, where there has been documented instances of, changes in guidelines and whatnot in response to corporate requests. So there's pretty direct influence there of the corporations, and there's no, um, you know, not as much felt presence from the public health community, which doesn't have the sort of funding and lobbying weight that the corporations do. So Maine is fortunate in having a citizen legislature, so that our legislators are not full-time paid professionals who, can potentially spend a lot of more time forging close bonds with corporate lobbyists. And so I think that was worked in Maine's favor in this case. And I think the fact that Bill, you and others were farmers and understood firsthand the trauma of this experience for farm families, in one single, instance, their potentially losing their health, their home, their business, their profession, the land they loved and worked on for years. I mean, it's a very a scale of loss that is hard to fathom.
Yeah, and yeah, and I also didn't know about PFAS before going into the legislature, but I started to be approached by some of those advocacy groups, but also by the farmers that I were my same age that came to Maine at the same time. Most of them MOFGA farmers, and I often thought of the phrase "there, but for the grace of God go I," because we were all looking for land around the same time, starting our new farms around the same time, and I happened to be on my piece of ground here that is fortunately safe, but I could have easily chosen to buy a piece of land closer to Unity, or that would have potentially faced a lot more contamination. In my own personal story, besides for being in the legislature and working with advocacy groups and MOFGA to make changes, there were two farmers that were distributing their products through our CSA who were affected by PFAS contamination early on. And so those are folks that I knew well, that I had been at the MOFGA training programs and education programs with. And so seeing their story, knowing that it was just a fluke of luck, that I wasn't in their same situation, facing the contamination of the family, the impacts on their families, impacts on their businesses, was just all the more motivation to like do this kind of work. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of MOFGA's early work around supporting farmers who are affected. And so MOFGA and Maine Farmland Trust worked together to form the PFAS support fund, PFAS fund, that really was the first of its kind in the nation, which said, okay, if you're a farmer who's affected by PFAS, then you can come to us for technical assistance, for remediation assistance, testing assistance, how marketing assistance. How do you stay in business, and how do you try to clean up the situation? And maybe you need to move where you're growing, so you're not growing on the contaminated field, but you're growing on a field that's safe, or change exactly what you are growing. We know through research at the University of Maine that the PFAS is taken up in the soil to a much lesser degree in fruits. So things like peppers and tomatoes and squash, versus plants where it's in the actual structure of the plant, more like a kale or a chard or spinach. So maybe depending on levels of contamination and how it shows up, if it's just in your irrigation water, then we can put filtration on the irrigation water so that it isn't, so you're not continuing to contaminate the ground and perhaps stay in business. So MOFGA put together this support fund, and within a couple of years, it was mirrored by support from the by the legislature. Put together a fund. It started off at 60 million, and quickly now it's around $100 million that the Department of Agriculture at the University at Maine has spent to support farmers. And this is, in some cases, buying the land that is too contaminated for production anymore, and giving the farmers a chance to pick up and start work again somewhere else. And so many of our legislative successes came because farmers were willing to come forward and talk about their experiences. And when farmers talk to legislators, when farmers talk to politicians, politicians listen. And so that's why that kind of support is so vital, because right now across the country, there are over 4,000 different farms that have received letters from the Department of Defense saying that their land is likely impacted by their activities. A lot of cases, the DoD, Department of Defense sites were using AFFF firefighting foam, which is essentially PFAS itself. And they're spraying it. It's going out in the land, going into the water. And these farms aren't coming forward nationally to talk about their experience, because the only choice they have is between going out of business, and if they tell everybody what's going on because there's no support for them, or staying in business and just hoping that the contamination isn't that bad. So at the federal level, what MOFGA is doing is working on the Relief for Farmers Hit with PFAS Act, which has been introduced by Senator Collins and Representative Pingree. So that's bicameral, meaning both the House and the Senate, as well as bipartisan support for doing something to support farmers. And in Maine, when we were passing legislation to support farmers, it was the most bipartisan effort we've ever kind of encountered. Everybody on both sides was supporting these changes. Regulating PFAS is a different story. But so trying to support farmers so that they can come forward and tell their own stories is really the core of so much of what MOFGA is trying to do nowadays at the federal level, and really, or in other states, trying to get that PFAS support fund replicated in other states is so important. Marina, next question. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wondered if you can speak to the status in terms of that effort federally, and whether you're starting to see, a little more uptake at the state level, given the difficulty getting things through Congress these days.
Yeah. So we're really working on a farm. So there is a farm bill. I'll go just brief history of what the Farm Bill is. Like the major legislative vehicle that moves support for farmers and support for agriculture forward in our country. It's something that's been going on for decades. Both parties come together and work to create a farm bill. Usually the Democrats are, because SNAP, meaning food stamps, funding is included in there. So Democrats are brought to the conversation by support of SNAP. And then Republicans are often brought more directly for support of farmers, commodity style farmers in the Midwest. We have not, we're still working off of the 2018 Farm Bill. Congresses have not been successful in passing another farm bill since 2018. So when we get our Relief for Farmers Hit with PFAS Act reintroduced every year, we really need a vehicle to put it into, because legislation very seldom moves forward in the Congress as a standalone bill. So we are still working to get it in, to see if a farm bill would pass, and to see if it could be our Relief for Farmers Act could be included in a farm bill. If it's not included in a farm bill, then perhaps we could find another vehicle for it, but that's a long-term effort. In other states, we've seen a lot more interest in regulating PFAS than in the explicit support for farmers. We have been successful in bringing in other farmer advocacy groups that are often to the right of MOFGA, right of some of the sustainable ag groups. So Farm Bureau, certainly Farmers Union, and corn growers and the Western growers, which is a lot of vegetable growers, as well as soybean growers, all very interested in farmer support. And advocating for that at the federal level. We've been engaged in a process with American Farmland Trust for going on 18 months now, trying to advocate as a group, as a coalition, for change at the federal level. In state level, a lot of work is being done on regulating sludge, looking at PFAS in sludge, trying to understand, is there a healthy level of PFAS in sludge? Of course, in Maine, we don't believe that there is a healthy level for PFAS in sludge. The repeated, it could be that a single application won't contaminate your ground to the degree you won't be able to grow food on it anymore. But if there's repeat applications through the years, and remember, these fluorine carbon bonds don't break down. We call them forever chemicals. So you put it on the ground in the 1970s, do it again in the 1980s, again in the 90s, and now you can end up with ground that is no longer safe for growing. So seeing increased interest across the country and that kind of stuff, and looking at consumer products that really, obviously, it should not be in our Teflon pans for use like that.
Yeah, the organization Safer States helps track the PFAS policy across the country, and so if you want to get a better sense for, who is putting forward legislation in different areas around the country in terms of PFAS, that's a great resource.
And just here, if you do have questions for us, go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll try to address them. And Marina, I had a question here. We're often told, as we're working with corporations and opposition, that PFAS is everywhere, and therefore, really, how can we even begin to remediate it or address it? And so we shouldn't take any action on it because we're all living with it in our bodies. And I know in your book there was an appendix about minimizing exposure, and you just mentioned Safer States and trying to get educated. What kind of things should people be thinking about trying to minimize their exposure?
I do have a section on minimizing exposure, and I definitely advocate people doing that, but not in response to the corporate line of, it's everywhere, so no need to do anything in the policy sphere or the regulatory or the research arena, because it permeates everything now and we may as well get used to it. I think that's just a horribly cynical perspective put out, and I do think that we need to put most of our efforts into collective action in response to this challenge. And towards the end of the book, I talk about, not only is it the 15,000 chemicals in the PFAS class, but we are just drenched in unregulated chemicals, globally now. They're coming down in the rain. We have got to, a group of scientists that look at sort of critical tipping points in terms of, our civilizational survival, have identified the intense growth of toxic chemicals as, one of those critical areas that we really need to rein in. So by all means, people should try to avoid their exposure, as everyday consumers, and that can be everything from, the personal care products, cookware, some of the things Bill was mentioning earlier, the products, basically be wary of things that carry water resistant or stain resistant advertising. That is typically an indicator that PFAS chemicals may be involved. I would say, filter your water. You can get the activated carbon or the RO filters are effective at whatever level. You can do that at a minimum at a sort of kitchen sink where you're drinking the most water would be important. So those are small actions, but the larger action is really collective.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's collective action when it comes down to it, and that's so much of what MOFGA has been trying to do. We've bringing us from the past to the present, looking at some of the more recent actions the EPA has taken. This is in the last 30 days. So the EPA continues to approve new PFAS herbicides and PFAS pesticides for use, putting them directly into our food system. When I first heard about that, I didn't realize that there were PFAS pesticides out there. And when I realized that as a state, we were supporting farmers and trying to remediate their land to remove the PFAS from it. But at the same time, farmers could be out and applying these PFAS pesticides. It's just incredible that continues to be something which is approved, and even with new pesticides. And even our Board of Pesticide Control here in the state of Maine has said, well, the EPA has approved it, so therefore we can approve it too. And one of the beautiful things about Maine is that the Board of Pesticide Control actually has the power and the authority to not follow lockstep with EPA. And so Maine, our MOFGA, continues to be active at the Board of Pesticide Control level as well as at the federal level, trying to make sure that we reduce some of our dependence on them as food producers, but also reduce our exposure to them broadly and our environmental exposure to them. And of course, being MOFGA, we advocate for an organic approach to agriculture, which does not depend on pesticides. And we see at the end of the day that kind of work to be in balance with nature, be in balance with your soil, provides benefits. That means you're not as dependent on these pesticides, whether they be PFAS pesticides or glyphosate or anything else down the line. EPA is also walking back some of the regulations around water and PFAS in your water, giving water supplies, public water supply systems, a longer period of time to become into compliance with their rules around two different kinds of PFAS, PFOA and PFOS, and which is, of course, a shame. And then they've deregulated some of the newer, shorter chain PFAS, saying that the process to implement the regulations for reducing our PFAS exposure in our water that happened under the Biden administration were not put into place correctly. So MOFGA continues to submit comments at the federal level and organize with our coalition partners to try to make sure that we do have safe drinking water in the country. And then most recently, they've also walked back their regulations on PFAS in sludge. They had a draft risk assessment, which came out about 18 months ago, just at the very tail end of the Biden administration. They put it together, which recognized that PFAS is toxic and poses a special hazard to farmers, right? When we are in contact with the ground, when we're in contact with these quote unquote soil amendments, the sludge, which is going on the ground, it affects us most personally. And we've got farmers in Maine who, when you look at their blood serum levels for PFAS, they're actually higher than those who are working in the factories producing the PFAS. So when farmers are drinking our contaminated water, drinking our contaminated food, inhaling the contaminated dust, the cumulative impact on our bodies is real. And so even if you're somebody who doesn't believe that PFAS should be taken out of the food system, but you are somebody who advocates for farmers, recognizing that this is a real danger for farmers in our day-to-day lives and farm families is very important. So that draft risk assessment recognized that draft risk assessment has now been walked back by the EPA. Now they have voluntary guidelines, which continue to recognize that there's dangers to human beings, but doesn't actually recommend anybody to slow down their exposure. One thing that was really interesting, those voluntary guidelines, was they recognized that 20% of the sludge across the country is actually being sold direct to consumer. And a lot of that is being bagged into fertilizers being sold for use at home garden centers. So in those big box stores, one of the famous brands is Malargonite. Put in a box, put in a bag, sold very cheaply. People are going home and they might have no reason to have PFAS exposure in their home gardens, but now they're putting it into there directly. And there's no regulation at the federal level saying that this is not something that should happen. Just a real shame. So coming together as organizations, coming together as people to stop this was important 10 years ago, and it continues to be important today. Jennifer, do we have a couple of questions that I should?
There's a question in the chat here. Has there been any research to determine how far PFAS travels in underground sources of water?
Marina, yeah. I have asked that question of a state hydrogeologist, and it can go a mile or more. It's so dependent on the configuration in a particular location, but it is it can travel a substantial distance. It's not just like the immediate surroundings, and I think we've seen this in real life, around military sites and fire training areas. The impact can be quite far out.
Yeah, I was going to think about a particular instance here that's under active investigation by the DEP, which was Hawk Ridge, where Casella was operating for many years, and even before Casella owned it, was operated by other groups that were trucking in sludge from Massachusetts, keeping it here, and then composting it or mixing it with clean soil to reduce the contamination, the concentration of contamination in it. And it was being stored there, and then they were reselling it to gardeners or to farmers for use as a compost. But it was in operation for decades there. And there was a lot of land application immediately around the site. And there was a collection pond on site where it was supposed to trap a lot of the material that was running off from the pad where it was storing the sludge. But what they're finding is that there's PFAS contamination from that, not only in the underground plumes in our drinking water, but surface water miles away from the initial site. So Casella has applied to start closing down that site because we've stopped the importation of the sludge from out of state. And and it's going to be a long-term process that the DEP is now working on exactly how to be able to close it effectively. And we're lucky that we have a very strong regulatory environment for making sure the DEP makes sure to ensure that it's closed correctly. I think it could be strengthened in some ways, but it's going to be a many years long process, likely involving litigation. And I just wanted to, as we're getting down on time here, wanted to mention MOFGA is currently suing the US EPA over their failure to regulate PFAS in sludge nationally. They've recognized that it's a toxin. They've recognized that it's in sludge. But their argument is that just because they've recognized it as a toxin doesn't mean that the Clean Water Act forces them to take any action on reducing our exposure to it. And so it's a legal argument that doesn't hold water when we think about it from a common sense perspective. But MOFGA's out front, along with a couple other partners, farmers from Johnson County, Texas, whose land was poisoned by PFAS, as well as public employees for environmental responsibility, PEER, who's taking the lead with the legal work on that and ensuring that that someone is trying to hold EPA accountable for some of the actions they've taken.
Marina, did you have a thought you wanted to share there?
Yeah, just in terms of the compost, people think about it in terms of, folks with their home gardens buying at, big box stores or something, and that is a part of it. But the Hawk Ridge facility here for years was delivering to schools, golf courses. There was widespread application of compost from that facility in all sorts of places. And we've had in Maine a lot of schools in unexpected places that didn't seem to have any obvious source of exposure, end up with high PFAS readings in well water. Some of that could be, some of that may be from floor finishings that were used in the school, which also can be high in PFAS, but some may also be attributed to applications on athletic fields over the years.
Yeah, I'm just going back to that idea, and please add any questions that you may have in the chat. The emotional toll, all of this takes on you, like when you're just thinking about the impacts on families, on school children, on the farmers, on the businesses. It's just, and then knowing that it's everywhere, it's emotionally difficult. And Marina, I don't know if you want to talk about just how, if you do maintain hope, if you're able to maintain hope on this, and just how you've dealt with that, like kind of emotional weight of the work.
Well, I have to say, as a journalist, it's been at one step remove. It wasn't my home, my well. And I really hold up all of the people I interviewed in the book who have dealt with that, in their immediate life. And they have demonstrated remarkable courage and strength in oftentimes taking collective action, working. One of the farmers most affected early on, went on to become a campaign organizer working to try and reduce toxic health. Others, citizens around Fairfield, organized themselves, in a Facebook community to lobby the legislature, to educate others. They've really, a lot of the folks in Maine have become models nationally for others. And so I think, it has been a devastating experience, personally and collectively here. But I do think that, and part of my hope for the book was to offer a roadmap to other places as communities, as they discover the degree of their contamination, to have a little more sense of a collective response and to draw some strength from the stories here.
Yeah, and I think, telling stories, doing that narrative building work of be able to talk about what's happening in your life, how you're impacted, whether it's by PFAS or some other environmental issue that you're dealing with. Maybe it has to do with cancer and folks in your area. I was in Virginia just last week talking to folks impacted by sludge spreading and talking about the concentration of cancer in their community, and being rural people who knew that they were taking the sludge that was coming from DC or Baltimore, and it was polluting their own homes and polluting their own bodies. And I think a willingness to tell that story, tell it to the media, tell it to the politicians, that's what makes the difference at the end of the day. And so MOFGA is trying to pick up that story from our own farmers and spread it nationally, so that it can, just as Marina did with her book, and make sure that we're creating a map so we don't do this again. So we can see that when we don't follow that precautionary principle that Rachel Carson was talking about, that there are real effects on human beings, on families and children. And it's vital that we take those steps and we tell our politicians to take them for us. Thank you so much for your time, Marina. Thank you for doing this. I think we're going to try to do something similar at the Common Ground Fair, at the Public Policy Teach-In. We'll also have at least one impacted farmer joining us. We really hope everybody comes to the fair and come to the Public Policy Teach-In. And I'll put my email in the chat here, so you can contact me for more information or how to get involved. MOFGA has a public policy committee that we meet once a month, talk about how to work on these issues and how to work together to make sure the voices of farmers are being held up in Maine and nationally. Marina, did you want to say any last things?
No, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you being willing to do this. And thank you, everybody, for taking your time to be here today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jennifer.